What would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for looked you in the eyes and chose someone else? Imagine this: a wedding hall full of strangers, crystal glasses, soft music, smiling faces, and then, without warning, a bowl of boiling soup flying straight toward your face. Not an accident, not a mistake, a message. And when you look to your son, the boy you raised alone, the boy who once called you his hero, he doesn't defend you. He doesn't stand up. He crosses his arms and agrees. In that moment, something inside you dies, but something else is born. Because humiliation doesn't always break people. Sometimes it sharpens them. This is not just a story about betrayal. It's a story about silence used as a weapon, about power hiding behind politeness, about a mother who waited, watched, and made one phone call that quietly destroyed an entire family's illusion. And by the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself one uncomfortable question. Was it revenge? Or was it justice? The night was supposed to mark a beginning, but instead, it became an ending. The kind you don't plan for, the kind that arrives dressed in elegance, pretending to be celebration. The reception hall glowed with soft lights and polished smiles, crystal glasses clinking as if nothing in the world could go wrong. Music floated through the air, gentle and rehearsed, designed to calm everyone into believing this moment would be remembered fondly. And then, without warning, reality cut through the illusion. A bowl of steaming soup left someone's hands and flew across the room. Not by accident, not from carelessness, but with intention. It hit her face like fire. Heat, pain, shock. The kind of pain that steals your breath before it reaches your skin. The spices burned her eyes. The liquid soaked into her dress. But worse than all of it was the silence that followed. A silence so complete, it felt heavy. No gasps, no footsteps rushing forward, no voice saying, "Are you okay?" Just dozens of people looking down, suddenly fascinated by their plates, as if humiliation were contagious. And standing across from her, calm and composed, was the woman who had thrown it, wearing a smile that wasn't angry, wasn't impulsive, but practiced. The kind of smile someone wears when they believe they've finally won. What makes moments like these unbearable isn't the pain itself. It's the betrayal that arrives with it. She turned instinctively to her son, because that's what mothers do. Even when they're hurt, even when they're burning, they look for the one person who is supposed to stand up, defend them, say something, anything. But her son didn't rush forward. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't even look surprised. He sat there, arms crossed, posture closed, and delivered words that would echo longer than the pain on her skin. She's right. 3 words, quiet, firm, final. In that instant, years collapsed. Late nights, early mornings, sacrifices no one ever applauds, a lifetime of choosing someone else before yourself, gone. And the strangest part, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't beg for an explanation. Something inside her understood, with brutal clarity, that asking why wouldn't change the answer. So she did the only thing left. She wiped her face slowly, carefully, with whatever dignity hadn't been stripped away yet. She stood up straight, and she walked away while the room stayed frozen, pretending this wasn't happening. But this wasn't a story about weakness. This was a story about patience. Because before she reached the exit, before the doors closed behind her, she reached into her purse and took out her phone. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was steady. She dialed a number she had saved weeks earlier, a number she hoped she would never have to use. When the line connected, she said only 3 words. It's time. No explanation, no emotion, just certainty. Then she hung up. Outside, the night air felt cooler, against her burning skin as she got into her car and drove away, the city lights blurring through her windshield. And as the pain settled into something deeper, a question circled her thoughts like a storm looking for land. How did it come to this? Because there had been a time when that same son used to cling to her hand, a time when he looked at her like she could do anything, a time when love felt permanent. That night taught her something no one wants to learn, that sometimes the people you raise, the people you protect, the people you give everything to, are capable of the deepest betrayals. By the time she reached home, the night had fully claimed the city. She removed the ruined dress and let it fall to the floor, not with anger, but with finality. This chapter of her life was over. What happened next wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. It was something quieter, colder, more dangerous. Silence. Because silence, when paired with truth, can dismantle entire lives. That night wasn't about a bowl of soup. It was about power, about control, about a woman who believed humiliation would keep someone in her place, and a mother who realized, far too late, that love without boundaries becomes permission to be destroyed. But as she sat alone, skin still stinging, heart cracked open, one thing was clear. The wedding hadn't marked the end of her story. It had only exposed the beginning of theirs, and what followed would change everything, quietly, irreversibly, and forever. Long before the wedding lights, before the polished smiles and quiet cruelty, her life was defined by routine, resilience, and responsibility. She had learned early that survival doesn't announce itself. It whispers through habits. Every morning began the same way. Coffee brewed strong enough to wake the bones, sunlight creeping through thin curtains, hands already aching before the day officially started. She lived modestly, not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood something many never do. That stability is built inch by inch, not handed down. When her son's father walked out, leaving behind nothing but silence and unpaid promises, she didn't collapse. She adapted. She learned to stretch time, money, and strength farther than they were ever meant to go. There was no backup plan, no safety net, just her hands, her will, and a child who depended on her completely. And so she became everything at once: provider, protector, teacher, and comfort. Not because she wanted praise, but because there was no alternative. Her work was quiet, invisible to most. Fabric, thread, patience. She sewed for people who never learned her name, altering wedding dresses she would never wear, repairing suits for men who would never notice the hands that fixed them. Her fingers bled more times than she could remember. Her back ached constantly. But every stitch carried intention. Every finished piece meant rent paid, groceries bought, school supplies covered. Her son grew up watching this without realizing what it meant at the time. He saw her working late, nodding off over the sewing machine, then waking before dawn to make his breakfast. He heard her say, "We'll figure it out," when bills piled up. He learned responsibility by watching someone carry it without complaint. And in those early years, he adored her. He called her his hero. He promised he would take care of her someday. Those promises felt real then, earnest, untouched by the world. As he grew older, her sacrifices multiplied quietly. College applications, tuition, living expenses. She worked more, slept less, denied herself even small comforts. No vacations, no new clothes, no indulgences. Everything went toward one goal: giving her son a future that wouldn't cost him his body the way hers had paid the price. When he was accepted into college, she cried alone in the kitchen. Not from pride alone, but from relief. Relief that maybe, just maybe, the hardest part was over. And for a while it seemed true. He graduated. He got a job. He wore suits she tailored herself. He brought her flowers on Sundays. He kissed her forehead and told her none of it would have been possible without her. Those moments mattered more to her than money ever could. They were proof that the sacrifices had meaning, that love, when given fully, came back. But success changes people subtly before it changes them completely. The visits grew shorter, the conversations lighter, less personal. He spoke more about networking, appearances, expectations, words she recognized but didn't belong to her world. She didn't resent his growth. She celebrated it. What she didn't notice at first was how her presence began to feel inconvenient to him. How her small apartment, her worn furniture, her simple routines reminded him of something he was trying to leave behind. She never asked for more time, never demanded attention. She believed love didn't need to be chased. That belief would cost her dearly, because while she was still living the values she had taught him, humility, gratitude, loyalty, he was learning new rules. Rules where appearances mattered more than history, and distance felt easier than respect. By the time she realized something had shifted, the foundation she thought was unbreakable had already begun to crack. And she didn't yet know how much of that foundation had been deliberately eroded by someone who saw her not as a mother, but as an obstacle. The first time she met her, nothing seemed openly wrong. That was the most dangerous part. The woman greeted her with perfect posture, impeccable clothes, and a smile that looked polite enough to fool anyone not paying attention. But there are smiles that reach the eyes, and then there are smiles that stop just short, like a door closed gently but firmly in your face. This was the latter. Their first meeting took place in a restaurant, chosen carefully, not for comfort, but for statement. Everything was expensive, everything whispered status, and from the moment they sat down, it was clear who belonged there and who was merely being tolerated. Conversation stayed safe, shallow, weather, work, plans. Nothing personal. Nothing warm. Her son squeezed her hand under the table as if reassuring her, and she wanted to believe him. But she noticed how the woman referred to her by her full name every time, adding a polite title that felt less like respect and more like distance. Not cruel, just cold. And cold, she would later learn, can be far more intentional than open hostility. As time passed, the politeness hardened into something sharper. Invitations came, but they were invitations where she was present, never included. Dinners in large houses filled with things meant to impress rather than welcome. She noticed how staff were spoken to without eye contact, how decisions were announced rather than discussed, how conversations were designed to establish hierarchy. Her son seemed comfortable there. Too comfortable. He laughed more easily. He spoke less. He listened more. And every time she tried to offer an opinion, it was acknowledged with a nod and dismissed moments later. Nothing aggressive, nothing obvious, just the steady erosion of relevance. The woman never raised her voice, never insulted her directly. She simply made it clear, through tone, timing, and omission, that this was no longer her territory. And the worst part was watching her son accept it without resistance. The cruelty was never loud. It arrived wrapped in manners and wine glasses, comments about standards, about expectations, about what was best for the future. Each word chosen carefully to sound reasonable while carrying a clear message underneath. You are from another world. She felt it when wedding plans were discussed without her, when decisions were announced as fate's accomplice, when her son avoided her eyes during those moments, as if silence could shield him from guilt. And when she finally spoke up, just once, she saw the shift. The woman's eyes sharpened, the room cooled, the power dynamic corrected itself instantly. Her son looked down at his plate. That was when she understood something fundamental. This wasn't about class or money alone. It was about control, about isolating him from the one person who knew him before ambition reshaped him. By the time she left those gatherings, she often felt smaller than when she arrived, not because she lacked worth, but because someone else was actively reducing it. Still, she said nothing. She told herself it was temporary, that all families struggled during transitions, that love would eventually reassert itself. But deep down, a quiet instinct warned her otherwise. This woman wasn't threatened by her strength. She was threatened by her history, by the memories she carried, by the truth she represented. Because as long as she existed, her son had a past that couldn't be rewritten. And for someone trying to reshape him completely, that past had to be erased. She didn't yet know how far this woman was willing to go, but she would soon learn that smiles without warmth often hide intentions without mercy. The distance didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way fog does, soft, almost polite, until suddenly you realize you can't see the road anymore. Sundays, once sacred, became negotiable. Calls that used to last an hour were cut short with familiar excuses, meetings, dinners, plans that couldn't be changed. She told herself this was normal, that sons grow up, that marriages shift priorities. She smiled through it, nodded when he apologized, reassured him she understood. What she didn't say was how quiet her apartment felt when the phone stopped ringing, how meals tasted different when cooked for one, how absence can be loud when you're used to presence. She never accused him, never demanded explanations. Love, she believed, shouldn't feel like interrogation. But every cancelled visit chipped away at something she had once thought indestructible. The exclusions became clearer with time. Wedding discussions happened without her. Decisions were made before she ever heard about them. She learned about events secondhand, rehearsals, dinners, gatherings she wasn't invited to but was expected not to notice. When she did ask gently, the answers were always reasonable on the surface. It was last minute. "We didn't want to bother you." "You wouldn't have enjoyed it." Each explanation sounded considerate. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns tell the truth even when words don't. She watched her son grow more polished, more careful, more distant. He spoke a new language now, one filled with appearances and obligations. When she offered opinions, they were acknowledged and ignored. When she stayed quiet, no one noticed. Either way, she was fading. One afternoon, a small flicker of hope returned. She was invited, finally, to help choose a wedding dress. The request felt like an olive branch, and she reached for it eagerly. She arrived early, dressed carefully, heart lighter than it had been in weeks. But the moment passed quickly. Surrounded by laughter that didn't include her, and opinions that overrode hers, she became invisible again. When she offered honest advice, kind, experienced, meant to help, it was brushed aside with subtle condescension. Laughter followed, not cruel laughter, just enough to remind her she didn't belong. And when the outing ended, she watched her son leave with them, without her, without hesitation. That was the moment something inside her finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the truth seep in. She wasn't being forgotten. She was being removed. The final blow came quietly, the way betrayals often do. A dinner meant to reconnect turned into another performance. Talk of luxury, gifts, futures built on money she knew didn't exist. And then, without shame, Her son asked her for financial help. Not because he needed it, but because he knew she would give it. She did. Of course she did. That was the moment she understood her role had changed. She wasn't his foundation anymore. She was his safety net. Useful, convenient, disposable. That night, sitting alone with a familiar mug warming her hands, she finally admitted what she had been avoiding. Love without boundaries doesn't protect. It erodes. And the silence she had chosen to preserve peace had only taught others that her pain came without consequence. She didn't yet know how she would respond. But she knew one thing with painful certainty. Being pushed out quietly hurt far more than being thrown out loudly. It arrived on a quiet afternoon, the kind that lulls you into believing nothing important will happen. The shop was slow, the light outside dull and steady, her hands moving from habit rather than urgency. When the delivery knock came, it startled her. Not because it was loud, but because it felt misplaced. The envelope was plain, no return address, her name written in deliberate strokes. Something in her chest tightened before she opened it, the way instinct warns you before your mind catches up. Inside were photographs. At first they made no sense. Familiar places, familiar faces. Her son, smiling in ways she hadn't seen in months. And then the second figure came into focus. Too close, too intimate. The world narrowed to the thin gloss of printed paper, and the sound of her own breathing as understanding crept in, slow and merciless. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was a truth that had been moving in the shadows, waiting for light. She sat down hard, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Photographs spreading like evidence she hadn't asked for but could no longer deny. Restaurants, parking lots, hotel entrances, a hand on a back, a smile meant for someone else. And in the final image, the one that emptied her lungs, an unmistakable embrace. Familiar, private, wrong. Her son and the woman who had worked so carefully to erase her. The room tilted. She made it to the bathroom just in time, the body reacting before the mind could form words. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it comes with nausea, with disbelief so heavy it pins you to the floor. When she returned, the photographs were still there, unmoved, indifferent to the devastation they carried. She gathered them slowly, each one confirming what her instincts had been whispering for months. In that stillness, memories rearranged themselves. Every cold glance, every subtle dismissal, every effort to push her aside suddenly made sense. This was never about class or comfort. It was about competition, about possession, about removing the one witness who knew her son before manipulation rewrote him. And her son, her only child, had allowed it. Worse, he had participated. The realization hurt more than the images themselves. She hadn't lost him gradually, as she once believed. She had been replaced deliberately. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to hear her response. She could scream. She could confront. She could run to him and demand explanations. But she did none of those things. Instead, something colder took shape. Not hatred, clarity. Because emotion clouds judgment, and she needed her vision sharp. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. Not out of vengeance, but necessity. Truth without proof is dismissed. Pain without evidence is labeled drama. If she was going to step into this storm, she would do it armed with facts. She saved a number she had once been given casually, never expecting to use it. A professional, discreet, thorough. As the city lights came on outside her window, she placed the envelope back together, sealed it, and sat in silence long enough for resolve to replace shock. She dialed, introduced herself calmly, and asked for everything. Dates, locations, money trails, the full picture. When the call ended, she didn't feel relief. She felt ready. Because once you see the truth clearly, there is no going back to pretending. And from that moment on, silence was no longer surrender. It was strategy. The investigator didn't look like someone who delivered earthquakes. He looked ordinary. Calm voice, neutral expression, the kind of man who could disappear into a crowd without leaving a trace. They met in a quiet cafe, far from familiar neighborhoods, a place chosen precisely because no one lingered long enough to notice anyone else. When he placed the folder on the table, it made a soft sound, but to her it felt deafening. He warned her to breathe before opening it. She thought she was prepared. She wasn't. Inside were timelines, receipts, hotel records, surveillance stills, evidence layered so carefully, it felt surgical. The relationship hadn't been recent. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been ongoing for over a year, long enough to build routines, long enough to normalize secrecy, long enough to rot something from the inside without anyone noticing until it collapsed. As she turned each page, disbelief gave way to something far more unsettling: comprehension. Money was the next revelation, and it landed harder than the photographs. Transfers, large ones, regular ones, payments disguised as gifts, favors framed as support. Her son wasn't just involved, he was dependent. The investigator explained it plainly, without judgment, which somehow made it worse. Financial reliance creates leverage. Leverage creates obedience. And obedience, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. But the real fracture came when the investigation widened. The family's wealth, the house, the status, the effortless superiority, was a facade. Mortgages stacked on top of mortgages, businesses bleeding money behind polished storefronts, desperation masked as confidence. The power she had felt in every room suddenly revealed itself not as strength, but as fear dressed expensively. Then came the inheritance, a trust structured carefully, triggered by marriage, protected until the right conditions were met. Conditions that made the upcoming wedding far more than a ceremony. It was a transaction, a doorway, and once opened, the consequences were irreversible. As the investigator laid it out, calmly, methodically, the pieces locked together with sickening clarity: the manipulation, the urgency, the need to isolate, control, and silence. This wasn't just betrayal. It was orchestration. And at the center of it all stood her son, no longer a passive participant, but an active piece on someone else's board. When the investigator hesitated before playing the final recording, she already knew it would hurt. But knowing doesn't lessen impact. Hearing your child agree to something unthinkable changes the meaning of every memory you've ever shared. When the recording ended, the cafe noise rushed back in, cruelly normal. Cups clinked. People laughed. Life continued, unaware that something irreversible had just been revealed. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She simply closed the folder and thanked the investigator. He offered options: law enforcement, legal intervention, exposure. Each carried consequences: prison, public disgrace, permanent severance. She listened without interrupting, because the decision had already formed. Justice didn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it meant restraint. Sometimes it meant letting someone walk far enough into their own choices that turning back was impossible. She would not save her son from the cliff he had chosen, but she would make sure no innocent person fell with him. As she left the cafe, one truth anchored her steps. The wedding wasn't the finish line. It was the trigger. There are decisions that announce themselves loudly, and then there are those that arrive quietly, asking for everything you have left. She carried the folder home like a weight she could not put down, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The evidence didn't argue. It didn't ask for interpretation. It simply existed. And with it came a choice no parent should ever face. Protect the child you love, or protect the people he was willing to sacrifice. That night, she sat at her kitchen table long after the city went quiet, coffee cooling untouched, staring at nothing and everything at once. Love pulled one way. Responsibility pulled the other. She understood with aching clarity that intervening too early would only push the truth deeper underground, and doing nothing would allow it to metastasize. The decision wasn't about revenge, it was about timing. She thought about confronting him, imagined the words, the denials, the familiar way he would deflect responsibility. She imagined warning the bride, saving her from humiliation and danger, only to realize how easily truth can be dismissed when it arrives without proof and authority. She considered the police, the clean finality of handcuffs and headlines, and felt the weight of what that would mean. A son branded forever, a mother blamed for the fall. None of those paths felt right, not yet. What she needed was distance, space for truth, to reveal itself without her pushing it forward. Silence, she realized, could be an instrument rather than a wound. Used carefully, it could force others to expose what they were trying to hide. So she prepared instead. She organized documents. She memorized timelines. She kept her voice steady in conversations that scraped at her nerves. When she was excluded, she smiled. When she was overlooked, she nodded. Each small indignity became a note in a ledger she no longer shared. The wedding invitations went out. The plans solidified. The momentum built. And with every step toward the altar, the risk increased, not just for her, but for an innocent person being led into a trap disguised as tradition. That was the line she would not cross. Whatever else she endured, she would not allow silence to become complicity. By the time the date was set, her resolve was complete. She would attend. She would observe. She would wait for the moment when truth could no longer be reframed as misunderstanding. And when that moment came, when cruelty showed its face openly, she would make one call, not to destroy, but to stop, not to punish, but to protect. This wasn't abandonment. It was restraint sharpened by love. The kind of love that refuses to rescue someone from consequences they chose willingly. As she closed the folder and turned off the lights, she accepted the cost of what she was about to do. Some decisions don't let you keep everyone. They only let you keep your integrity. The wedding arrived dressed as spectacle. White flowers flooded the cathedral, candles flickered against stone walls, and every detail whispered money, legacy, and control. She sat several rows back, placed carefully where she would be seen but not centered, present but irrelevant. As the ceremony unfolded, she watched faces instead of vows. She watched her son avoid her eyes. She watched the bride glow with a happiness built on lies. And she watched the woman who had orchestrated everything sit with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already secured. When the vows were spoken, they sounded rehearsed, polished, hollow. Promises of trust floated through the air like fragile glass, beautiful until touched. Applause followed, smiles widened, the illusion held. And yet, beneath it all, something was tightening, waiting. The reception was worse, opulence pressed in from every angle, crystal centerpieces, linen-draped tables, laughter that rang a little too loud. She was seated far from the head table, surrounded by strangers who made no effort to know her name. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to belong. She was there to witness. From her seat, she saw the glances, the ones exchanged when no one thought they were being watched. She saw the subtle signals, the quiet authority exercised without words. And when the music slowed and the mother-son dance was announced, the room shifted. Eyes followed her as she stood, cameras lifted, expectations sharpened. This was the moment meant to prove unity. Instead, it revealed the truth. They moved together across the floor, bodies close but worlds apart. She asked simple questions, her voice steady, her expression calm. He answered quickly, defensively, as if rehearsed. When she mentioned names he didn't want spoken, his grip tightened. When she referenced truths he believed buried, his composure cracked. The music continued, but the dance ended. Voices rose, attention gathered, and then it happened. The final display of dominance. A bowl lifted, a step forward, heat and liquid crashing into her face as the room gasped too late. The humiliation was immediate, public, absolute. And when the woman responsible declared it deserved, the silence that followed was heavier than the act itself. Her son's agreement landed last, and deepest. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She wiped her face slowly, deliberately, refusing to give them the satisfaction of spectacle. As she turned toward the exit, she made the call. 3 words, that was all. The doors closed behind her without pursuit. Inside, the celebration unraveled. Outside, the night swallowed her whole. She drove away knowing the wedding hadn't marked a beginning. It had exposed an ending long overdue. Because the truth, once invited into the room, doesn't leave quietly. And by the time the music resumed, the consequences were already on their way. The truth did not arrive loudly. It didn't kick down doors or shout accusations. It walked in calmly, escorted by authority, and let silence do the work. While the guests were still whispering and staff scrambled to regain control, the ballroom doors opened again, this time for people no one could dismiss. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Music died awkwardly. Faces turned pale as realization spread that this was no longer a private scandal. The bride was pulled aside gently, confusion written across her face as evidence was placed in front of her, piece by piece. Photographs, records, timelines, the kind of proof that doesn't invite debate. She read, listened, and then collapsed, not theatrically, but as someone whose body simply refused to hold the weight of betrayal any longer. In that moment, celebration officially ended. What remained was reckoning. Her son stood frozen at the center of it all, stripped of charm and certainty. Words failed him. Every explanation dissolved before it was spoken, because lies can't survive under direct light. Guests who had smiled minutes earlier now stared with open judgment. Phones appeared discreetly, capturing fragments that would later spread far beyond that room. The woman who had once controlled every detail attempted denial, then outrage, then tears, each tactic less effective than the last. Authority doesn't respond to performance, it responds to facts, and facts had finally chosen their side. As the weight of exposure settled, the illusion of power collapsed. What had once seemed untouchable now looked fragile, desperate, small. Outside the ballroom, consequences accelerated. Legal steps were initiated before midnight. Protective measures were put in place. Assets were frozen. Decisions were made not out of emotion, but necessity. The bride was removed from danger and placed in care, surrounded by people who spoke to her with honesty instead of manipulation. Meanwhile, inside the venue, reputations disintegrated. Alliances vanished. People who had benefited from proximity suddenly remembered distance. By the time the truth finished speaking, no one stood beside the ones it condemned. Isolation followed exposure with ruthless efficiency, and somewhere far from the chaos, she sat alone with a cup of coffee, feeling neither triumph nor regret. What she felt was finality. The truth had done exactly what it always does when given room. It corrected the narrative. It didn't scream. It didn't seek revenge. It simply rearranged reality so no one could pretend anymore. By morning, nothing would look the same. And for the first time in months, she slept without fear, knowing that silence, used wisely, had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath too long. News traveled fast, faster than she expected, but none of it reached her directly. She didn't watch the videos, didn't read the comments, didn't defend herself. She returned to her routine, to the rhythm that had sustained her long before betrayal disrupted it. Coffee in the morning, work that kept her hands busy and her thoughts steady. Silence, no longer heavy, but earned. What surprised her most wasn't the absence of her son. It was the absence of guilt. She had expected regret to creep in during the quiet hours, but it didn't. What came instead was a calm acceptance. She hadn't acted out of anger. She hadn't destroyed anyone. She had simply stopped protecting lies. And once lies are no longer shielded, they collapse on their own. When her son finally came to her door, weeks later, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but internally. Like someone who had lost the structure that once held him upright. He spoke softly, apologized clumsily, blamed others before catching himself. She listened without interrupting, because this wasn't the moment for correction. It was the moment for truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, unyielding. She didn't offer rescue. She didn't offer punishment either. What she offered was clarity. Love does not erase consequences. Care does not mean compliance, and forgiveness, if it ever came, would not arrive on demand. He left that day without shelter, without certainty, without shortcuts, and for the first time in his life he would have to build something without leaning on someone else's sacrifice. As for the woman who had orchestrated so much damage, the system moved slowly, but it moved. Power dissolved when stripped of secrecy. Control vanished when witnesses stepped forward. The very traits she had relied on, confidence, manipulation, silence, became liabilities once exposed. The innocent were protected. The guilty were isolated. Justice, imperfect but necessary, took its course. And through it all, she stayed where she had always been, on the outside of spectacle anchored in principle. She didn't celebrate the downfall of others. She didn't mourn it either. Some endings don't deserve ceremony. They only deserve acknowledgement. In the end, letting go wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of love refined by wisdom. Love that no longer confuses endurance with virtue. Love that understands boundaries as protection, not rejection. She didn't lose a son that night. She released an illusion, and in doing so, she reclaimed herself, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to face who they've become, without you standing in the way. And with that understanding, she stepped forward, unburdened, into a life that was finally, fully her own.